Welcome to Tribe of Tribes, your monthly window into alternative Arab culture. I'm Aziz.
And I'm Brian. Add Yusuf to the mix, and we make Kuwaiti, a Seattle-based rock band with songs in Arabic and English.
Alternative Arabia is defined by its outcasts, minorities, and vulnerable communities. So once a month, Brian and I get together to talk about our band and global affairs shaping the world.
Our listeners can expect segments that dive deep into artifacts, narratives, and complex topics demanding our attention.
We all come from a tribe, whether it's by birth or choice. This is where everyone's baggage becomes one big pile.
Beyond a podcast,
It's a tribe.
I wanted to focus today a little bit on the idea of banning books. This is a theme that we've come up against in different ways, as I'm sure that you have. So we have been looking at the rates of book bans in Kuwait specifically, and we've been very surprised actually to see how many books are actually banned in the US. And so, Brian, I think you growing up around just like a more conservative culture also give you insight into some of the things that Americans are just afraid to approach.
Yeah, I would definitely say so. In my school, like my high school and middle school, like libraries, there was no LGBT representation books. In fact, the school district I grew up in banned one of the books we're reading for Bushwick this year, Genderqueer. It's odd that I wouldn't have had access to in school, but it could be a valuable resource for many people. Instead, just no one thinks about it. You're not allowed to be queer or even think about what that means. And that's true for all the ideas that are censored, with Uncle Tom's Cabin being the first nationally banned book, and that creating like sympathy for enslaved people. It's always this idea of repressing the access to knowledge. So if people can't access this story, they can't learn to empathize or sympathize with this group or whatever it is.
And books get banned for different reasons. So that these span immorality to, in our side of the pond, insulting Islam, inciting violence, lacking public taste, or disturbing the peace. A number of reasons that they can frame what the whole reason for it is, but it really makes you want to focus on this idea of the importance of reading, just especially with people having the shorter attention spans and really not being able almost physically, it seems, to sit down and just go through paragraphs of text. It seems like we're on the edge of something, and if we don't do more to preserve some of those habits or approaches to knowledge absorption, there might be something that's lost in our humanity.
Like losing not only literacy in the sake of like actual physical reading ability, but the literacy in the way of digesting a large text and understanding like overall themes or like character growth and like the skills that come from absorbing like a book. It's first of all more of a commitment, but also it's more of a journey. You do more mental exploration throughout a text. Like you might see yourself through the characters, or you see the characters as they grow, and that reflects some aspect of your life. Whereas you can read an article and have somewhat of a similar experience, but that article is most likely going to be a single instance. You sit down, you read the whole article, start to finish. But a book,
Right.
You typically don't just sit and read like a 600-page novel in one sitting. Like you read it over a week or a month. And so like the story kind of travels with you as you live your life for that month. I've especially felt that as I've been reading a lot more heavily this year. I'm thinking about these stories and the characters and like what's happening in the story throughout my days. And a book is more absorbing almost. Like your phone, even if you're reading like the Do Not Disturb on or whatever, like you have notifications, you have all this. Any distraction that you can go to instantly from your phone. Like a physical book, there's no notification.
Yeah,
And there's another thing is as you're reading, physically move each page, but also you see where you are when you stop each time. Oh, I'm about halfway, I'm about a third. And they say that actually helped you remember what happens in a story more than if you were to read digitally and just see like the percentage numbers.
Mhm.
Because you relate the actual like physical distance in the book that you traveled with what's happened in the story.
I've always been a big fan of books, I guess, since I was in my 20s. In my teenage years, I definitely had a resistance to them, but my parents have all these libraries. So I grew up around books, and it was a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction to their favorite thing to collect.
I see. So, yeah, you had to be anti.
I had to be anti for at least a little while. And then I came to the US and I was lonely. Kind of discovering the power of books through local libraries has been a game changer for me. Going to Penn State and then University of Illinois, some really outstanding libraries. But then also in New York and New Orleans, seeing the library as a resource that goes way beyond books. And that's been really eye-opening, especially the contrast between Louisiana and Washington Library, because I think we're very pampered here in Washington.
Let alone like entertainment, as in like books and movies and audiobooks and TV and all of that stuff, but also like the public services that are offered, the classes for kids, like I think study rooms, you can rent study rooms. Like,
Yeah, some of them you don't even need to rent them. You just walk into it.
you just like book it. And
You don't even need to book it. There are rooms that you book, but then there's also quiet rooms that just, it's like a study hall type of thing. Or, yeah, there's also obviously the DVDs and CDs and things like that. But then when you mentioned the thing around kids, like some of the libraries are actually designed in a way that encourages kids to walk in and browse and parents to sit there with their kids. We're not just providing children's books. We're also like designing the space around the specific need of the community. And this is enabled obviously by public participation. That's how they find out about these specific community needs. And it's definitely in the libraries, but then you also find it in other places like at the airport, maybe even some of the community gardens and deeper in Seattle. Maybe there's some kind of way that they encourage this kind of like local neighborhood oriented participation, which I'm a huge fan of. Even if someone doesn't believe in democracy with a capital D, let's say, you still have a lot of people who believe in being able to drive change, tangible change on a local level. So libraries are just a great example of that.
Yeah, one of the few like pure community resources that exists nowadays. Like that is funded by the government, at least. There's no expectation for you to purchase anything. Like everything is free pretty much at the library. You can print stuff and all this stuff. Whereas like the airport, you might have those community resources or whatever, but most people are going to the airport for commerce. The airport is a commerce hub.
Yep.
Whereas I don't think you could spend money at a library if you tried. Like late fees. That's the only thing there are no late fees in our library system. So I think the only thing you can pay money on is if you print over your like monthly limit, you can pay to print more. So yeah, it's pretty accessible here, but even if you live somewhere where it's a little bit less accessible, you still probably at least have books and the digital side of the library, which is a new thing, which is like Libby and all these other apps that you sync with your library card and you just check out digital books or audiobooks or movies. And it's taken the place of streaming services for a lot of people because like you can watch all these shows, you just had to rent a season at a time, or you can read all these books without ever having to go to the library from a Kindle or from your phone.
Yeah.
Even though we just talked about how that's not necessarily the most ideal, but better than reading no book.
It's also the convenience factor. Some people are going to be able to read more if they're able to have that provided to them. It's all about accessibility. And then another component of all of this is, of course, the different immigrant communities that cluster or emerge around local library branches, and seeing the way that branches, at least in Washington, embrace those immigrant communities and really build for them is really remarkable and something worthy of being studied, researched, replicated, so on and so forth. Yeah. So obviously you can tell that we love books.
Speaking of community organized events that we love, upcoming this year, we have the Bushwick Book Club, which if you don't know, it's a concert series where each month of the series, the artists are assigned a book that fits with the topic of the year. And then they read that book and write an original song corresponding. So this year's theme is banned books. And the month we're doing is a double feature on gender and sex.
Yeah, it's been really eye-opening. We basically chose 2 graphic novels, illustrated books that really dimensionalize the conversation around gender and queer identity, and also sex. Basically, one of them is a book that kind of explains sex in a very matter-of-fact way to children, preteens, I think. And so you have all these kind of like children's illustrations and speech bubbles that kind of talk about all the different dimensions so that it's less embarrassing for them. It's a little bit more affirming and creates some kind of scientific grounding for not just scientific, but also like social and all the other dimensions of sexuality and gender kind of baked in. And then the other is a graphic novel that's completely just absorbed in the life of the graphic novelist. And so in that one, you get to experience the life of a lesbian, basically as they're like developing self-awareness and going through the conversations with their loved ones. I've already been around a lot of bisexual and gay people and everything in between, I like to say. But there's also this element of the lived experience of what they go through and the nuance that I thought was really telling and helped me to understand the human condition on a fresh level. And I really like that about engaging with graphic novels. So going to Bushwick Book Club, one of the things that really make it stand out as an experience is the way that it sets you up to deliver a creative product through this prompt that they give you. And then you're there tweaking away on your own in the corner, like really obsessing about the details of what you're creating, and then coming to an event and kind of seeing what other people have come back to it with. But yeah, I guess, Brian, what are some of the things that you enjoy about engaging with Bushwick Book Club?
So we've played one and gone to one of the shows that we didn't play. I think just like the opportunity it provides for a lot of different musician voices, like from we've seen like more like bluegrass type to are a little more rock to like singer-songwriter. And it's all kinds are welcome. And you get to see how everyone interprets the same medium or the same prompt in completely different ways. Like how even two people can be talking about the same feeling that they got from the book and write two completely different songs, even about the same character or theme. So I found that especially interesting. And I think the choice of banned books for this year's topic and the political climate we exist in currently has just created like this extra flair and spice this year to Bushwick. More of a need for the art about these banned books to exist because they're being silenced.
Yeah, and they do a great job of just building that infrastructure with their live streams and just the ticketing. So it's not just an organization that's just a venue. They really provide a lot of things that we would need to grow and expand our reach. And I really appreciate a lot of what they do in terms of revealing these really unique spaces to us that maybe would have otherwise gone overlooked. The song that emerged from our first experience was Puppet, which I wrote along with Brian and Yusuf over the course of, was it a couple of months maybe?
Yeah, I think 2 or 3 months. It's still being written now, but you know how songs are. They're always being written, but the like major footwork was done in those first couple months. Yeah.
Yeah, it was really interesting to scope out the theme. You know, I focused the idea on being an influencer that's easily swayed by money, basically, and kind of seeing how people are willing to compromise so much of their values when it comes to ensuring that they live more than comfortably. They're really trying to milk the system and injustices to just make money, and it's okay if I'm going to throw a community or a certain segment of the population under the bus. I'm willing to do that as long as I'm getting my money. So over the course of developing Puppet, like you're saying, there's been an evolution where you brainstorm the idea of the song, it comes out, you perform it. And I guess a lot of people might be content to just keep it where it is. What's happened with Puppet is that we're still like adding kind of different arrangements, like the way that we're changing the first verse, because it's just like such a novel way of entering into the song, and it sets up the pre-chorus in a really nice way. And we didn't have that foresight when we're like under the gun to like just deliver the song to people.
I don't know if we mentioned it yet, but the book for that month that we played was Aesop's Fables, which is like the most famous collection of parables of all time. The one we did was The Fox and the Grape, which basically is just like a fox sees some grapes. He tries to jump to them. He can't get them, and then he's like, they suck anyways. So basically, he chastises what he can't have because it's too hard for him to get. So how does that relate to influencer?
So I came that through the mindset of the Watanji who like can't have freedom of expression. And so therefore they're like, oh, I don't want this absolute freedom. It's not really absolute freedom. It's just the freedom to criticize that which you're not happy with. And typically you're pointing a finger towards the government. So people who are not criticizing out of the fear are basically kind of in the same position as the fox who can't have grape. So freedom is the grape.
I see.
And it's always framed as this kind of, oh, we don't need absolute freedom. We're not talking about absolute freedom where you can just say whatever you want to say. And just even like in the US where people like think about the US as a place where you have absolute freedom, there's still social norms, there's cues, like you can get kicked out of places for doing certain things. People will lash back at you if, they're not happy with something that you say, or there's like this flexibility to be yourself. And then this kind of idea that something absolutist is even possible is a little preposterous because you're always expressing yourself and putting your stake in the ground in the context of other people receiving that and interpreting it and being impacted by it. All this to say really that no one has absolute freedom and everyone deserves freedom, even if it's somehow curtailed or controlled.
I think the facade of the American absolutist freedom is falling. Like Trump is really pushing against those ideas, and the checks and balances that were in place aren't strong enough. They're not strong enough to stop him from disappearing whoever they want to other and throw away. And that's happened many times throughout the U.S.'s history with the Japanese internment camps in World War II and the indigenous people who were here before us. And I'm sure there are many others. It's just, we hit these moments where the idea of like freedom that the whole country is patriotized on is really, we're forced to face it at a head. And the people who are still like drinking the Kool-Aid, so to speak, still see the absolute freedom because their freedom isn't being challenged. But everyone else's who freedom is being challenged is like sounding the alarm, is terrified.
Yeah.
Eventually those terrified people will be quelled and the status quo will return. At least that's what we've seen. And eventually like there will be a break, right? Like where enough happens that the status quo doesn't return to where it was. But how long will that take?
That goes back to the whole like literacy thing. Part of why we're doing this social exercise is because the role of academia and government and the media, journalism has really been minimized. Everyone's biased. Everyone's expecting you to be biased. There's no one that's able to moderate and de-bias the conversation. So it's been hard to find that like middle ground. And people like us are doing it, but we're still coming at it from a leftist point of view. And I can say some things that might appease someone that's on the right, but at the same time, it's clear that we have this leftist tendencies, socialist tendencies, whatever you want to call them. So the onus is a little bit on community organizers and people that are leading the charge in this more organic way. But we're also given something that is completely uncommon for organizers and people leading bands and athletes and whatever. Our role in society isn't to hold that middle ground. It's just be ourselves and trust that there is this kind of like ethical, moral, social infrastructure.
And I think discourse has changed a lot with the advent of social media and kind of the modern way we all communicate. Like the instantaneous reaction, and like you're posting a comment on someone's reel or something like, and that's how you engage with the anti of your argument. You're not actually engaging with the person, but they put out a piece and then you passively have replied to that piece. But most times there's not going to be discourse. Even if you get flamed in the comments and get 40 comments replying to you, that's not going to change your point of view. But if we sat down and we talked about it and we had different views, like we would either yell at each other and leave, or fight each other or come to some common ground. But that doesn't exist as much when you're just like responding to created content. I've been reading a lot of books this year, and so I'm going to virtue signal to you about all my book reading, give you a little bit of a review, takeaways, I don't know, my thoughts. There's no stars, there's no system. The first book I read this year was Make Your Own Rules by Andrew Wong, who's a YouTuber and digital content creator. It's like half memoir, half advice for being a creator in the digital age. So it's a lot of tackling the issues of like, how do you actually make money as a musician in a world where you can't just play anymore? So having all the different avenues of money making, but also like, how do you not get burnt out? And like, how do you define your values? And how do you work money and business into it without jeopardizing your values? And then he talks a lot about gender identity and like reaching a point of non-gender conformity, which I've started to relate to a lot. I've liked Andrew Wong for a while, so it's definitely a good book. Would recommend for all you creatives out there. This next book is a classic by the legendary George Orwell, 1984. This is the most classic depiction of dystopia. Very common terms that we use nowadays, like thought crime and doublethink, come from the story. Seeing the things that exist now and how scarily close they are to the reality we live in. These other dystopia things like being constantly monitored. We just have accepted that our privacy doesn't exist. So these markers of dystopia have now just become reality. And how do we face the world that way?
I think 1984 is probably one of the most important books for anyone to read.
The next book I read was Roe by Mary Ziegler. It is about the political usage of that court case and what happened on both sides and the different arguments that formed around it and how it became a national obsession for politics. It would always just fall back to Roe. So finding where to draw the line with those kind of issues, this book made me think deeper about it and just have a more nuanced understanding. Roots is an absolutely classic novel, kind of touted as the first African-American person to trace their history from slavery all the way back to historical Africa and find where they came from and how their family lineage got here and leads all the way up to them. The book as a historical piece and how it created a lot of empathy for people to see the whole story. Like, it's not just where we usually see slavery. It's just like the people are already enslaved and it's just that's life that they've been given. But instead we follow Kunta Kinte from birth. Like literally the first page is him being born. And it's from that to the middle passage, being sold, him trying to escape and that being punished. And then him eventually, like having a child and then that child's life and so on and so forth until the last end of the book is all about Alex Haley and how he wrote the book. And it's crazy because it starts like you're reading a historical fiction and by the end you're reading about the author's actual life. So it blurs the lines of like fiction and reality. Just the thread it created, I think, is really important for a lot of people. So this book, The Production of Space, was recommended to me by Aziz. Most of the book is talking about space and what that means, both physical and mental space. But the thing I found the most interesting was how spaces are often influenced by their creators and how most people in power throughout history have been men, mostly white men, and how spaces have been created for them in mind, whether intentionally or not. But that limits the voices that can be heard in those spaces. The world is not necessarily designed with them in mind, but instead designed with the way that the white male who created it thought. The next book here is Monkey Wrench Gang. It's about eco-justice and eco-sabotage. It's a fictional novel that kind of follows 4 young adventurers. They're doing all these like crazy Indiana Jones-esque feats. But it really prompted me to think a lot about at what point is explosive individual action, like these kind of violent sabotages, at what point do those trump and maybe even are better than collective action that maybe gets trapped in bureaucracy? The results are instantaneous with a violent action like that. Whereas you go through the bureaucratic method to try to limit coal production plants, that could take 10 years before anything happens. Whereas you blow up a coal plant, that coal plant's not operating anymore. It's interesting to think about where the limits of what you're willing to do to protect the things you care about. And in this case, it's like the earth and the environment, like the strip mining and all the things that this book talks about. That's what Utah is now. Like the Wild West that the Rocky Mountains was, that the Midwest was, it's not that anymore. It's highways and it's bridges and all these things. Just interesting to see how in 50 years the cause can change. The Mayor of Castro Street is about the lovely Harvey Milk, who is one of the first openly gay city commissioners in the US, in San Francisco. And it's just basically about his life story and then mainly his like political rise. For me, like the most shocking thing was like learning about Stonewall and not realizing how police brutality like extended to gay people and all these other oppressed groups, which is just with my own ignorance that I had faced. And it didn't stop. Just like some political quelling happened, but like the issue didn't actually get solved. Unchecked power in the police force. So like facing that and then realizing how people who might be considered straight publicly and how once they like came out as gay, it made it so much more socially acceptable, like Elton John or like all these other people who like now are gay icons. Harvey, when he talks about his early childhood, he talks about not knowing the word gay, not knowing the word homosexual. And so not knowing how to identify. And so like the awareness that he created, whether positive or negative, like that's like the real value is that more people are talking about what it means to be gay than before. This next book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, was the first nationally banned book and also credited for starting the Civil War. I found this book especially interesting because it's the first book I've read where the author constantly breaks the fourth wall. Like something sad happens or something tragic happens and the author is like, now can you see that doesn't matter the color of your skin, the tragedy of losing a child is the same. And I think that's what made this book so influential is it directly challenged these racist beliefs that people had. And I think that Harriet Beecher Stowe is trying to get into the motherly and like trying to get the white women, so to speak, to really empathize with this issue and bring the men along. I don't know if that was the goal, but when you read it that way, it seems really targeted towards like that mother audience almost. Like so many moments in the book focus on the tragedy of like childbirth or losing children or things that really people who have kids, I feel like would resonate even more with them than with me. This next book, Everything But the Burden, is a collection of essays about the commodification of Black culture and art. I found it interesting that a lot of it hasn't changed. Like the things it talks about, like the first chapter in the book is about Eminem. He was a poor white person and grew up directly alongside Black culture and how Eminem himself might not be commodifying Black culture in a dishonest way, but the way that he's marketed and the people who consume it are buying into this disingenuous expression of Black culture. The things it has to say are really still the same problems. Like this whole like orientalization of cultures. The way I experienced this in my own life was like getting into gangster rap in middle school, like Tupac and NWA and artists like this, which, you know, while themselves aren't disingenuously expressing Black culture, but the music companies and the people who are marketing them are like very much marketing their otherness. The problem is it's not enjoyed on its merit, but enjoyed by its otherness. So this book, Multi-Amory, made by the people of the same podcast name, is a book about modern relationships and like how do you navigate, whether it be a monogamous or non-monogamous relationship, how do you navigate communication and these common issues? How do you have time for relationship? And how do you diffuse conflict? How do you talk about money in a way that's not stressful? All of these kind of concepts that the book gives tools and maps out the behavior and positive communication for that. Because if you haven't had that behavior modeled for you, you're most likely not going to stumble upon it very easily by yourself. It's not only romantic relationships. So like any platonic relationship too, these communications tools can still be used because it's really about expressing yourself and your needs and wants. The next little selection I read was the Invincible Ultimate Collection Volume 1, which is the first 12 volumes of the comic. And reading it in this kind of like large hardcover format has made me really realize how much I enjoy graphic novels and comics again. I can't really say too much about the story without spoiling it, but it starts out as your generic teenage superhero, high school bullshit. But very quickly, you start to realize that the world is more than your traditional superhero world. And while the character might be physically invincible, the story really focuses on the emotional weight of his actions. And I think that's just such an interesting place to take a superhero story. As the story evolves, Mark definitely faces a lot of emotional situations that relate a lot to normal humans, though. It's not the emotions of having superpowers, but the emotions of dealing with trauma. So this book, Another Country by James Baldwin, very fantastic author, is a really great book. It starts about a jazz musician named Rufus and his life and really his inner monologue as we see him navigate an interracial relationship. His best friend is a white person. And eventually some things transpire that really makes it realize that the white character, Vivaldo, has a lot of bigotry that he has to face. And eventually that leads to that bigotry also extending not only to people of color, but also to gay people. And he has to face both those things at the same time. And I found that just like very interesting that bigotry, no matter what form it is, like it often extends into other bigotry. It's not compartmentalized. It's not individual, but it's rather, and in Vivaldo's case, is a form of self-hatred. And the book's written in this stream of consciousness kind of way where as the characters think about things, we're brought into their mind a little bit. So it's like this very interesting, I guess, second person point of view, the way that that paints the story and we see these characters react to things. James Baldwin's writing style is something I've become a big fan of. We've been talking a lot about books, and both cultures we come from have this history of censorship, specifically with books, but with many things. So I guess I've talked a little bit about Utah's history of censorship and kind of its repression in that way. So I'd like maybe if you touch on Kuwait's history with that as well.
Yeah. One of the things that's really stark about Kuwait is its contradictions. And one of my favorite contradictions is the one between censorship and freedom of speech and how they intermingle, right? So I grew up with censorship in textbooks, films like being cut, and it is jarring because you're also used to viewing this idea that there's a robust press journalism community in Kuwait. Typically, historically, we're talking about the Ministry of Information banning books as many as 4,000. Actually, the number is much higher. We're averaging almost 1,200 books a year. And moving forward, it's kind of passed for the Ministry of Information to a judiciary. So a lot of what's being processed is going to be through presumably people's complaints. So we'll see how things get reported. But because a lot of these people are not movie critics or literary critics or even readers or movie fanatics or anything, they're just really looking at it from the viewpoint of conservatism and serving the dominant culture. A lot of things end up getting banned. Some of it is because there's a Zionist actor, and then other times like, there's a lesbian lead in an animation, or there's like too many rainbows. I don't know. There's like all these symbols that end up getting managed, and there's a really like active society, it seems, that's like really invested in this idea of protecting kids, rooting out immorality, and really trying to control the symbolism that's shared in the country. One Kuwaiti writer succinctly put it as a literary massacre when she wrote her article in 2018. And you kind of wonder where things are going, but at the same time, it's just one of those things that's so integral to Kuwaiti culture and the lore that we're going to have to confront moving forward. And there's a lot of similarities with the way that censorship is exercised on the West as well.
And especially now, I think
Yeah.
the most recent administration has definitely increased our censorship. But looking at a statistic between 2023 and 2024, so before Trumpism again, or Trumpism 2.0, we saw a 63% increase in the US of book banning. That's so still, even with a Democratic president, we're still seeing these book bannings increase. And perhaps even more as this continues. Again, our numbers are outdated because it's just barely 2025. So we'll really see, I think, once we like reach midpoint to the end of this year, like the impact of this first half of the decade and really how deep the censorship goes.
For our send-off, would like to share the Arabic word of the podcast, and that is freedom. In Arabic, you say it as al-hurriya. That's the noun, freedom. To describe something, you say Falastin hurra, which means that Palestine is free or shall be free. And al-hurriya is a really important concept, obviously. I find it really ironic that when the U.S. opened their propaganda channel in the Middle East, they called it al-hurra, the free one. So for those of you already studying Arabic, you might want to note that this is not to be confused with the word for hot, which is har, the opposite of bard. So that's the word that I would recommend that you study and dig into and find how it's used in different sentences. It's a really handy one. So thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure to walk you through this elaborate expose on book bannings in the US and Kuwait. And Brian and I love doing this, and thank you for joining us. Brian, you have any words you'd like to share with the crew?
Go check out a book from the library.